This is not a story you've heard before, though its echoes might feel familiar. It unfolded not in a palace, but in a place that might as well have been one. The Pinnacle, a restaurant perched 70 floors above the glittering sprawl of Chicago, where the city lights looked like a carpet of fallen stars. A line was about to be drawn, not in the sand, but on a pristine linen tablecloth. We will take you inside that rarefied air, where a fourth-generation heir, Julian Croft Thor, his veins coursing with entitlement and vintage Bordeaux, attempted to publicly annihilate a young waitress with a $25,000 wager. He believed his fortune could purchase a moment of exquisite, cruel sport. He was catastrophically mistaken. What he failed to understand was that he wasn't just challenging a waitress. He was challenging the keeper of a forgotten legacy. The atmosphere inside the Pinnacle was a carefully curated symphony of hushed wealth. The clinking of crystal silverware against Bernardeau china was the percussion, the low murmur of conversations about acquisitions, and Aspen holidays was the string section, and the scent, a complex blend of truffle oil, expensive perfume, and the faint, clean smell of ozone from the floor-to-ceiling windows, was the enveloping harmony. For the patrons, it was the ambiance of a typical Thursday evening. For Ilara Vance, it was the backdrop to another grueling 14-hour shift. Ilara moved through the opulent maze of tables with a grace born of exhaustion and necessity. Her simple black uniform, severe and practical, was a shadow against the jewel-toned silks and bespoke suits of the clientele she served. The heavy silver tray she carried was a permanent extension of her right arm, balanced and steady, even as a deep ache began to radiate from her shoulder blades. The first rule of working at the Pinnacle was invisibility. Be a whisper that refills a water glass, a phantom that clears a plate. Your presence should be felt, but never truly seen. Tonight was a private event, a fundraiser for the city's contemporary art museum, which meant the usual concentration of wealth was distilled to its most potent, arrogant form. Ilara had served at countless such functions. She knew the cadence of the evening, the performative air kisses that smelled of hairspray and hypocrisy, the feigned interest in incomprehensible art, the gradual crescendo of noise as $1,000 bottles of wine were emptied. She navigated past a woman, adorned with a sapphire necklace so large it looked like a shard of the twilight sky, its deep blue flashing under the recessed lighting. The woman was laughing, a brittle, high-pitched sound, at a joke made by a man whose face was florid from a combination of sun, spirits, and unchecked hubris. They looked right through Ilara, their eyes registering not a person, but a function. Her manager, a stern but fair man named Mr. Dubois, had delivered his usual pre-shift briefing. "Head high, Vance. These people are sharks. They smell blood in the water. Be efficient, be silent, and whatever you do, do not engage." Engage, as if she had the spirit for it. Her feet, encased in the restaurant-mandated orthopedic shoes she loathed, were already throbbing. Her mind was a world away, replaying the conversation she'd had with the bank that morning. The notice about the loan application for her small business plan was polite but firm. Insufficient collateral. High-risk venture. The words were a death knell for a dream she'd been nursing for 5 long years. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she'd lost everything. 5 years since she'd traded the keys to her family's cozy Italian restaurant, Vino e Vita, for a name tag and a numbered locker in the staff room of the Pinnacle. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between taking an order and running a credit card, she could still conjure the scent of the old place, garlic sautéing in olive oil, the yeasty perfume of baking bread, and the rich, earthy smell of the wine cellar her grandfather had built with his own hands. It was a phantom limb, an ache for a life that had been amputated. She was meticulously polishing wine glasses at a side station when she felt a gaze settle upon her. It wasn't the usual careless glance of a patron trying to flag down a server. This was specific, analytical, and dripping with a kind of bored disdain. She instinctively straightened her spine, her professional composure a fragile shield, before turning her head slightly. The eyes belonged to Julian Croft IV. Even if you didn't recognize the name from the society pages, you knew the archetype. He was handsome in a way that seemed manufactured by generations of selective breeding and effortless wealth. A sharp jawline that had never known a hard day's work, hair the color of aged whiskey artfully tousled, and a Patek Philippe watch on his wrist that was worth more than her entire college education. He wasn't sitting in his chair so much as occupying it, a king holding court at a table of fawning supplicants. He was the scion of the Croft Consolidated Group, a real estate and investment behemoth whose name was etched onto the skyline of Chicago. He was flanked by his inner circle. To his right sat his fiancée, Isabella Thorne, a woman sculpted from ice and ambition. Her smile was a precise, blood-red slash, and her eyes, as they flickered towards Alara, held a chilling emptiness. On his left, two younger men, Alara mentally christened the Echoes, laughed on cue at whatever Julian murmured, their adulation a palpable force field around him. Julian's gaze lingered on Alara's hands as she polished a burgundy glass, her movements swift and sure. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing, judging. He leaned over and whispered something to Isabella, his voice a low, condescending drawl that carried in a momentary lull. Look at that. All that frantic energy, like little worker bees, aren't they? Utterly devoid of any real appreciation for what they're handling. Isabella offered a delicate, tinkling laugh. Darling, don't be cruel. It's just a job to her. She probably thinks a fine wine is anything that comes in a box. Ilara's grip on the stem of the glass tightened for a fraction of a second. The glass in her hand was a Riedel Sommelier series, designed specifically for Grand Cru Burgundy. She knew its weight, its balance, how the wide bowl allowed the delicate, earthy notes of an aged Pinot Noir to breathe. She knew this not from a training manual, but from a deeper, more ingrained place. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice, thick with his lingering Italian accent. Ilara, il vino non è solo una bevanda. È una storia in una bottiglia. Wine is not just a drink. It is a story in a bottle. You must listen to it. Don't engage. Be a ghost. Mr. Dubois' words echoed in her mind. She finished the last glass, arranged them perfectly on her tray, and turned to leave. Her dignity was the only armor she possessed. Excuse me, waitress. Julian's voice sliced through the ambient noise, sharp with command. Ilara paused, turning back slowly. Yes, sir. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a bottle of wine on his table, a 1990 Domaine de la Romanée Conti la Tâche, a bottle that cost more than her monthly salary. This wine, he declared, swirling the deep ruby liquid in his glass. It's magnificent. But my friends and I are having a debate. I say I can detect notes of black truffle and forest floor, a classic sign of its age and terroir. My friend here, he gestured to one of the Echoes, claims it's more saddle leather and dried roses. He leaned back, a smug smirk playing on his lips. What does a person like you think? Or is that beyond your pay grade? It was a trap, a deliberate, humiliating power play designed to put her in her place. He didn't want her opinion. He wanted to showcase her ignorance. It was a small, petty act of dominance for the amusement of his court. Ilara felt a hot flush of anger creep up her neck. For 5 years she had endured this. The dismissive waves of the hand, the the condescending tones, the utter, soul-crushing invisibility. This casual intellectual cruelty felt somehow worse. He wasn't just insulting her. He was desecrating a world she secretly revered. But again, the voice of reason, of survival, whispered, "Don't engage." She took a deep breath, schooling her features into a mask of polite deference. "I'm not qualified to offer an opinion on such a remarkable wine, sir. I'm sure your palate is far more discerning than mine." Her voice was a model of professional humility, but Julian was not done. Her deference seemed to bore him. He craved conflict. He scanned the room, his eyes lighting up as he conceived of a more entertaining game. He noticed another table across the room, where another titan of industry, Arthur Sterling, was dining. Sterling was old money, but self-made old money, a man who had built his own hotel empire and was a known rival of the Croft family. He was a man Julian both envied and despised. Julian's smirk widened into a predatory grin. He had an idea. A brilliant, terrible idea. "You know," he announced, his voice now loud enough to capture the attention of the surrounding tables. "This brings me to a larger point: authenticity. It's a lost art. Everyone these days is a fraud. They read a few reviews, memorize a few tasting notes, and pretend to be an expert." His gaze landed squarely back on Elara. "It's pathetic." He stood up, a towering figure of bespoke tailoring and inherited confidence. "So let's have a real test, a test of true palate." He snapped his fingers at Mr. Dubois, who was hovering nervously nearby. "Dubois, I want you to go down to the cellar. Bring up your most obscure, most challenging bottle, something not on the menu, a mystery wine, and bring 2 glasses. He then turned his attention back to Elara, the full force of his arrogance focused on her like a spotlight. "I have a proposition for you, little bee." Elara stood frozen, a deer in the headlights. The eyes of a dozen tables were now on her, sensing the blood in the water. "I will wager $25,000, Julian proclaimed, his voice ringing with theatricality. He pulled out a platinum money clip, thick with $100 bills, and began to count them out onto the table, the crisp notes landing with soft, obscene thuds. $25,000, all yours, a tip for the ages." A collective gasp went through the room. Even Isabella looked momentarily surprised before her expression settled back into one of cruel amusement. This was better than she could have imagined. "The challenge is simple," Julian continued, his eyes glinting. "You and I will taste the mystery wine, blind. You will tell me its grape, its region, and its vintage. If you can do it, the money is yours. But if you fail, if you are even 1 year off, you don't just get nothing. You get on your knees and apologize to my guests for wasting our time, and then you will walk out of that door and never work in a fine dining establishment in this city again." He glanced at the pale, horrified face of Mr. Dubois. "I will personally see to it. My family owns the buildings that house half the restaurants on this street." It was the ultimate public execution. He, Julian Croft IV, a man who summered in Bordeaux and wintered with vintners in Tuscany, versus her, a common waitress in orthopedic shoes. The imbalance was nauseating. He wasn't just daring her to taste wine. He was daring her to have a soul, an opinion, a history, knowing he could crush her for the audacity of trying. Elara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every survival instinct screamed at her to refuse, to apologize, to melt back into the shadows where it was safe. But then she looked at his face, at the smug certainty, the absolute conviction that she was less than human, a mere prop in his evening's entertainment. She saw the foreclosure notice for Vino e Vita. She saw the defeated slump in her father's shoulders. She saw 5 years of swallowing her pride, of serving men like him, of pretending she was nothing. And she thought of her grandfather. She thought of his gnarled, gentle hands swirling wine in a glass, holding it up to the light. Listen to it, Elara. It will tell you its secrets. She looked at the pile of cash on the table. It was an insulting, vulgar display, but it was also a chance. It was the seed money to bring Vino e Vita back to life. It was a lifeline to the person she used to be. But it wasn't the money that cemented her decision. It was the look in his eyes. It was the absolute, unshakable belief that she was, and always would be, nothing. Across the room, Arthur Sterling, a man in his late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a face etched with the lines of tough decisions, lowered his fork. He had been watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of distaste. He knew Julian Croft for what he was, a pale, spoiled imitation of his ruthless father. But as he watched the waitress, he saw something shift in her posture. The fear in her eyes was being eclipsed by a different light, a flicker of cold, hard fire. He leaned forward slightly, his dinner forgotten. This was about to become far more interesting than the museum's balance sheet. Elara took a slow, deliberate breath, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading into a distant hum. Her gaze met Julian's, and for the first time that evening, her professional mask crumbled away, replaced by a chillingly calm resolve. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the clarity of a bell in the sudden silence. "I accept your wager." A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. Julian Croft's arrogant smile faltered for a heartbeat. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. He had designed the dare to be refused. The victory was in her public submission. Her acceptance was an unexpected move on the chessboard, but his ego, a vast and ravenous creature, quickly reasserted control. Of course she accepted. For a girl like her, $25,000 was a fortune. The public humiliation would be all the sweeter. This was going to be magnificent. "Excellent!" he boomed, clapping his hands together. "A little courage. I admire that. Dubois, fetch the wine." Mr. Dubois, his face a mask of dread, scurried towards the cellar, his career flashing before his eyes. He pleaded with Elara with his eyes, but she didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely on Julian. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm, "if we are to do this, we do it properly." Julian raised a curious eyebrow. "Oh? And what does properly mean to you?" "It means we both taste blind. The bottle will be brought to the table in a bag. Your man," she gestured to Mr. Dubois, "will pour for both of us. We will each write down our assessment, the varietal, the region, the vintage. Then we will reveal them simultaneously." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "No hedging? No changing your answer after hearing mine?" The audacity of her setting the terms stunned the room. She wasn't a participant anymore. She was a duelist. Julian, amused by her spirit, which he still saw as the last gasp of a doomed animal, agreed with a magnanimous wave of his hand. "As you wish. Let the games begin." Elara's movements were methodical. She walked to a nearby service stand and placed her tray down, her hands rock steady. Then she reached behind her back and untied the strings of her apron. She folded it into a neat, precise square and placed it on the tray. It was a shedding of a skin, a quiet declaration. Without the apron, in her simple black slacks and blouse, she looked different. Less like a servant, more like a sommelier. Finally, she looked down at the clunky, sensible shoes on her feet. With a fluid motion, she slipped one off, then the other, placing them neatly beside the stand. She stood before them now in simple black socks. A murmur spread through the crowd. This was no longer just a spectacle. It was becoming a ceremony. Arthur Sterling watched her every move, his expression unreadable. He recognized the ritual. It was the way a surgeon prepares for a complex operation, the way a musician tunes their instrument. It was the focus of a true professional. Mr. Dubois returned, his hands trembling slightly as he carried a bottle shrouded in a black velvet bag. He placed 2 identical, empty glasses on the table between Julian and Elara. He then carefully poured a 3-ounce measure into each glass, the glug of the wine the only sound in the cavernous, silent room. The liquid in the glass was a pale, shimmering gold. Julian picked up his glass with a flourish, holding it to the light, a confident smirk on his face. He swirled it dramatically, stuck his nose deep into the bowl, and inhaled. "Ah," he said, knowingly. "Complex." Elara ignored him. She picked up her glass, but she did not look at it. She closed her eyes. In that self-imposed darkness, the restaurant vanished. The scent of truffle oil and perfume was gone. She was standing in the cool, damp earth of her grandfather's cellar. She could feel the rough stone walls, smell the aging wood of the barrels. His voice was in her ear, a gentle guide. "First, Elara, just hold the glass. Feel its temperature. Cool? Cold? That is the first clue." The glass was cool, not cold. It had been cellared correctly. "Now look, the color is a language. Is it pale like straw, deep like honey? Look at the legs, the tears, as they run down the glass. Are they thick and slow, or thin and fast?" She opened her eyes. She tilted the glass against the white tablecloth. Pale gold, with hints of green at the rim. Youthful. The legs were moderately thick. Decent alcohol content, perhaps some residual sugar. And now, the nose. This is where the story begins. Do not rush. One gentle sniff. What is the first thing it tells you? Then, swirl. Wake it up. Introduce it to the air. Now, what does it say? She brought the glass to her nose. The first scent was sharp, almost aggressive. Petrol. A distinct note of gasoline. A novice would be put off, but for Elara it was a thunderclap of recognition. There was only one noble grape in the world that developed that specific, beautiful note with age. Riesling. She swirled the wine gently, coaxing it open. The petrol note softened, and underneath a universe of aromas bloomed. White peach, lime zest, honeysuckle, and a bracing, unmistakable minerality, like the smell of wet stones after a summer rain. It was clean, focused, and incredibly precise. Julian was already jotting down his answer on a napkin with a gold pen, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He thought he had it. He believed it was a high-end white Burgundy, a Meursault, perhaps, the rich man's default for impressive white wine. Elara took a sip. The wine exploded on her palate. It was electric. A searing acidity was the first thing she felt, a lightning bolt down the center of her tongue, but it was perfectly balanced by an off-dry sweetness, a whisper of honeyed apricot that coated her mouth. The finish went on forever, a lingering echo of slate and citrus. The story was complete. The petrol on the nose, the laser-like acidity, the hint of sweetness, the overwhelming slate minerality. It could only be one thing: German Riesling. The region was obvious from that slate note, Mosel, and the age. The petrol note was present but not overpowering, the fruit still vibrant. It was mature, but not ancient. She triangulated in her mind. It had to be from a great vintage, one known for longevity and acidity. 1998? No, the fruit was a little brighter. 2001? Closer. It tasted like a classic year. She settled on a number. She took the pen offered by Mr. Dubois and wrote on her own napkin, her hand perfectly steady. "Finished?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Ilara nodded, placing her napkin face down on the table. "Excellent. On the count of 3, he announced to the room. 1, 2, 3. He flipped his napkin over with a flourish. In his elegant script were 3 words: Chardonnay, Burgundy, Meursault. 2005. Ilara turned her napkin over. Her handwriting was simple, clear, and precise. Riesling, Mosel, Germany. 2001. A confused murmur went through the room. They were so wildly different. One of them had to be catastrophically wrong. Julian laughed out loud, a short, barking sound. "Riesling. From Germany." "My dear girl, they don't serve that kind of pedestrian wine here. You've just cost yourself $25,000. Dubois, reveal the bottle." Mr. Dubois, his face pale as a sheet, reached for the velvet bag. With trembling hands, he slowly pulled it off the bottle. For a moment, there was absolute silence as people craned their necks to see the label. Then, a single, audible gasp came from a nearby table. The label was stark white, the lettering Gothic and elegant. It read, Jo Jos Prumvelener Sonnenuhr, Riesling Auslese Goldkapsel, 2001. The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in a wave of shocked, incredulous noise. It wasn't just that Ilara was right. It was that she was so precisely, so incredibly right, down to the exact vintage of a famously esoteric and difficult-to-identify wine. And it wasn't just that Julian was wrong. His guess was so fundamentally, amateurishly wrong, it was laughable. He hadn't just lost his wager. He had lost every ounce of his credibility. He had been exposed as the very fraud he'd decried. Julian Croft de Fort stared at the bottle as if it were a serpent. The blood drained from his face, leaving a mottled, red and white mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His confident smirk had dissolved into a slack-jawed rictus of disbelief. He looked at Ilara, truly seeing her for the first time, and the contempt in his eyes curdled into raw, venomous hatred. But Ilara wasn't finished. She looked at Mr. Dubois, her voice soft but clear. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the bottle. He nodded numbly. She picked it up, her movements now filled with an authority that captivated the silent room. "It's a magnificent bottle," she said, speaking not to Julian but to the room at large. The 2001 vintage in the Mosel was legendary. Perfect conditions. But she paused, running her finger along the top of the cork, which was slightly raised. "This bottle is suffering from poor storage. The cork is pushing. It's likely been exposed to heat at some point, which has accelerated the development of those petrol notes and slightly muted the primary fruit. A perfect bottle would be even more vibrant." That final expert observation was the killing blow. It was a level of connoisseurship that was beyond reproach. She hadn't just won the bet, she had conducted a masterclass. The applause that followed was thunderous. It was a standing ovation. Arthur Sterling was on his feet, clapping slowly and deliberately, his eyes, sharp and calculating, fixed on Ilara. He wasn't just seeing a waitress who knew her wine. He was seeing an asset, a weapon. The ovation crashed over Ilara, a physical force that made her sway on her feet. It was the validation she hadn't realized she was starving for. It wasn't just about the wine. It was about the memory of her grandfather, the honor of her family, the reclamation of a part of herself she thought was dead and buried. But her moment of triumph was violently interrupted. Julian, his face contorted with rage, snatched the pile of money from the table. The carefully curated mask of civility was gone, revealing the ugly, spoiled child beneath. With a vicious, hateful gesture, he threw the entire stack of cash at her. The bills exploded in the air, fluttering down to settle around her socked feet like a shower of green, insulting confetti. "There," he spat, his voice a low, vicious snarl that cut through the dying applause. "There's your money, you pathetic little trickster. You think you're clever? You got lucky. Now take your tip and get the hell out of my sight." The room fell silent again, shocked by the sheer venom of his reaction. He wasn't a sportsman losing gracefully. He was a tyrant whose power had been challenged, and he was trying to reassert it in the only way he knew how, with the brute force of his wealth. By throwing the money, he was trying to reduce her victory back to a simple transaction, to remind her, and everyone else, that she was still just the help, and he was the one who paid the bills. Elara looked down at the $25,000 scattered on the floor. It was the key to Vino e Vita, the key to her future. A desperate, practical voice in her head screamed at her to stoop, to gather the bills, to take the money and the humiliation and run. But then she looked up and met Julian Croft IV's hateful eyes. She saw in them no respect, no acknowledgement of her skill, only the bitter, festering wound of his own inadequacy. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't take it. To accept that money now would be to accept his terms. It would mean that her knowledge, her passion, her grandfather's legacy, everything she had just fought for, had a price tag. And that price was $25,000. With a calmness that felt otherworldly, she looked him directly in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent restaurant with the cutting edge of a diamond. "I think there has been a misunderstanding, Mr. Croft," she said, her tone level and cool. "This was never about your money." She took a single step back, away from the scattered bills as if they were contaminated. "My grandfather's legacy," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power, "is not for sale." She held his murderous gaze for one beat longer, letting the full weight of her refusal sink in. Then, without a single glance at the fortune on the floor, she turned her back on him. With her head held high and her back ramrod straight, she walked across the plush carpet, her bare feet silent. She moved past the stunned tables, past the gaping face of Isabella, past the dumbfounded echoes. She walked directly to the service stand, picked up her neatly folded apron and her clunky, sensible shoes. She did not hurry. She moved with the deliberate, unassailable dignity of a queen abdicating a throne she had never wanted. As she reached the swinging doors to the kitchen, she passed Mr. Dubois, who was standing frozen, his face a cocktail of awe and terror. "Vance, he began, his voice a choked whisper. Elara gave him a small, weary but genuine smile. "It's all right, Mr. Dubois. I believe I quit." She pushed open the door and vanished into the clamor and steam of the kitchen, leaving behind a ballroom in stunned silence, a billionaire consumed by his own public immolation, and $25,000 lying untouched on the floor. The spell was broken by a single, dry voice. It was Arthur Sterling. He turned to the man dining with him, his expression one of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. "Well," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That was the most exquisite bit of theatre I've seen in this city in 30 years. He had seen more than just a public shaming. He had seen poise under pressure. He had seen profound, encyclopedic knowledge. He had seen unimpeachable integrity. Most importantly, he had seen the perfect person to be the face of the crown jewel of his new flagship hotel, the Sterling Grand, set to open in 6 months, a direct competitor to the Croft family's hotel portfolio. He turned to his assistant. "Find out everything you can about that young woman," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "I don't want her name from the restaurant's HR file. I want to know her story. I want to meet with her before the sun comes up." Meanwhile, Julian Croft IV stood paralyzed in the center of the room, the wreckage of his ego strewn about his feet. Isabella finally glided to his side, her touch on his arm hesitant, her crimson smile gone. "Julian, perhaps we should leave," she whispered, her own face pale. The fun had soured into a disaster. The whispers around them were no longer of admiration, but of ridicule. His grand performance had cast him as the villain, the bully, and worst of all, the ignorant fool. He violently shook her hand off. His eyes were fixed on the kitchen doors through which Elara had disappeared. The humiliation was a physical burn in his chest. This wasn't over. He didn't know how yet, but he would find a way to destroy her. Not with a public spectacle, but with the quiet, crushing weight of his family's influence. The Crofts did not suffer public embarrassment. They buried it. A young freelance journalist, dining on the company's dime and looking for a society story, was already typing furiously into his phone under the table. He had it all: the arrogant wager, the shocking reveal, the thrown money, the defiant refusal. He knew this was infinitely more than a gossip column piece. This was a modern-day morality play, a story of David and Goliath played out over a glass of Riesling. He already had his headline, and he knew, with the instinct of a born storyteller, that by morning the entire city would know the name Elara Vance. The internet works with the speed of a wildfire and the memory of an elephant. By 7 a.m. the next morning, the journalist's story, published on a major online news portal, had achieved viral velocity. The headline was a masterpiece of clickable outrage. Croft Heir wagers $25K on wine, gets schooled by waitress who walks away from the cash. The article was devastatingly effective. It painted a vivid picture: the opulent restaurant, the sneering billionaire, the quiet, dignified waitress. It detailed the absurd wager, Julian's catastrophic error, and Elara's final, powerful act of defiance. But it was the quotes from anonymous onlookers that added the final twist of the knife. He wasn't just wrong, he was arrogantly wrong, one diner was quoted. She didn't just identify the wine, she gave its biography. Then she walked away from that money as if it were trash. It was the classiest thing I've ever seen. By 9 a.m., Lasenat Waitress. And the wine was the #1 trending topic nationally. The memes had already started. Julian Croft's face photoshopped onto a milk carton under the word "missing credibility." For Elara, the morning was a disorienting tempest. She'd woken on the lumpy sofa in her tiny studio apartment, the adrenaline of the night replaced by the cold, gnawing dread of unemployment. She had publicly humiliated a man from one of the most powerful families in Chicago. She had quit her job. She had walked away from life-altering money. The harsh light of day made her actions feel less like a heroic stand and more like career suicide. Her rent was due in a week. The dream of Vino e Vita felt more distant than ever. Her aging smartphone, its screen a spiderweb of cracks, began to buzz incessantly on her coffee table. It was a text from a former co-worker. "OMG Elara, have you seen this? You're a legend." Then it buzzed again, and again. Calls from unknown numbers, friend requests from hundreds of strangers. She finally clicked the link her friend had sent, and her world tilted. She saw herself, her story, her act of defiance, amplified for the world. The comments section was a tidal wave of support. "This woman is my hero. Julian Croft IV is proof that money can't buy class or a palate. Someone give this woman her own vineyard." A GoFundMe page had been started by a stranger under the title "A Tip Jar for Ilara Vance." Its goal was $25,000. By noon, it had crested $100,000 and was still climbing. It was surreal. 24 hours ago, she was a ghost. Today, she was a symbol. Meanwhile, in a sprawling penthouse office with a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, the mood was decidedly less jubilant. Julian Croft III, a man whose ruthlessness was as legendary as his fortune, slammed a crystal paperweight onto his marble desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot. The digital edition of the Wall Street Journal was displayed on a massive screen, featuring an article not in the society section, but in the business column, headlined, "Croft Consolidated Stock Dips Amidst Heir's PR Fiasco." "Explain to me," Julian III said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "how you managed to turn a $10,000 bottle of wine into a $10 billion public relations catastrophe." His son, Julian IV, stood before the desk, his face pale and drawn. "It was a joke, father, a bit of sport that got out of hand." "Sport?" his father hissed, rising from his chair. He was a shorter, more compact man than his son, but he radiated an aura of such immense, cold power that he seemed to suck the air from the room. "Our brand is built on an image of untouchable prestige and expertise. You allowed a waitress to publicly castrate you in your own supposed field of knowledge. You haven't just made yourself a laughingstock. You have made the Croft name look weak, foolish, and fraudulent. We are getting calls from the board. Our partners in the new Dubai Tower are concerned. You didn't just lose a bet, you idiot. You put a crack in the foundation of this entire enterprise." Isabella had already called, tearfully, to postpone the wedding indefinitely. Her press-savvy parents had advised her to distance herself from the toxic brand. The echoes were no longer returning his calls. He was completely, utterly alone. "I will fix this," Julian IV stammered. "You will do nothing," his father snapped. "You are a liability. You will issue a public apology, written by our legal team, and then you will disappear to the London office until I say otherwise. Your public life in this city is over." Humiliated for the second time in 12 hours, Julian Croft IV retreated from his father's office, a ghost in his own life. Back in her tiny apartment, Ilara's day took another sharp, surreal turn. At 2:00 p.m., a sleek black town car pulled up outside her unassuming building. A woman in a flawlessly tailored suit emerged and buzzed her apartment. Cautiously, Ilara let her up. "Ms. Ilara Vance?" the woman asked, her tone crisp and professional. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am the executive assistant to Mr. Arthur Sterling." Ilara's mind reeled. Arthur Sterling, the man from the restaurant, the rival. "Mr. Sterling was in attendance at the Pinnacle last night," Eleanor continued, her expression unreadable. "He was extraordinarily impressed not only by your expertise, but by your character. He has asked to meet with you at your earliest convenience." She handed Ilara a heavy, cream-colored card. "He has cleared his schedule for the remainder of the day. A car is waiting for you downstairs, should you accept. A meeting with Arthur Sterling." It was a possibility so far outside the realm of her imagination that she couldn't fully process it. The viral fame was one thing, a fleeting, intangible phenomenon. The GoFundMe was a stunning act of public generosity, but this was different. This felt solid. It was a door opening, not into 15 minutes of fame, but into a world of real power and opportunity, the very world she had just publicly defied. "I'll get my coat," Ilara heard herself say, her voice a distant whisper. As she rode in the silent, leather-scented interior of the town car, watching the city streak past her window, Ilara clutched the heavy card in her hand. The fear and anxiety that had plagued her morning began to be replaced by a terrifying, thrilling spark of hope. The world had seen her win a bet, but Arthur Sterling hadn't just seen a spectacle. He had seen a professional, and for the first time in 5 long years, Elara Vance allowed herself to wonder if she might be one again. Arthur Sterling's office was the antithesis of the Croft penthouse, where the Crofts favoured marble, glass, and a cold, intimidating modernism. Sterling's office was panelled in warm, dark walnut, lined with bookshelves, groaning with volumes on history, architecture, and art. It felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like the library of a well-read scholar. The only view was a large, framed black and white photograph of the Chicago skyline, as it was in the 1950s, a reminder of a city built with grit, not just glass. Sterling himself stood to greet her, shaking her hand firmly. He was in his late 60s, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored tweed jacket that seemed more suited to an English countryside than a boardroom. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Miss Vance," he began, gesturing for her to sit in a comfortable leather armchair opposite his desk. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I trust my assistant explained my interest." "She said you were at the restaurant last night," Elara said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "I was," Sterling confirmed, sitting down. "And I must confess, I have not been that entertained in years. You stripped a Croft bare in public, and for that alone, the city owes you a debt of gratitude." He smiled, a brief, genuine flash of warmth. "But that is not why I asked you here. Your performance. It was more than just knowledge. It was passion. It was history. Where does that come from?" The question was direct, personal. Looking into his intelligent, curious eyes, she felt no need for pretense. She told him everything. She told him about her grandfather, an immigrant from Piedmont, who arrived with nothing but a love for the vines of his homeland. She told him about Vino e Vita, the small, beloved restaurant they had built together, a place where the food was simple but honest, and the wine list was her grandfather's pride and joy. She described the wine cellar he'd dug out by hand, the lessons he'd taught her, not just about grapes and regions, but about wine as a living history. Then, her voice hardening, she told him how they lost it. She described the predatory loan they were forced to take out from a subsidiary lending firm during a citywide recession. A firm that, she later discovered, was quietly owned by Croft Consolidated. They had used a complex, barely legal clause in the contract to foreclose on the property with breathtaking speed, only to flip it 6 months later for a massive profit as part of a larger real estate development. The stress and heartbreak had triggered her grandfather's final, fatal heart attack. "So when Julian Croft challenged me last night," she concluded, her voice thick with emotion, "he wasn't just insulting a waitress. He was standing on my grandfather's grave and mocking his life's work. Walking away from that money wasn't a choice, Mr. Sterling. It was the only thing I could do." A heavy silence filled the office. Sterling stared at her, his expression a mixture of grim understanding and something else, a dawning, strategic light. "My God," he murmured. The poetic justice of it all. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Miss Vance, I am opening a new hotel in 6 months, the Sterling Grand. It is the culmination of my life's work, and it is positioned to be a direct competitor to the Croft portfolio. I do not intend to compete with them on glitz or glamour. I intend to compete on authenticity, on character, on substance. Qualities the Croft name has just proven it knows nothing about." He paused, his gaze intense. "The crown jewel of my hotel will be its restaurant, the cellar. I need someone to build its wine program from the ground up, not just a sommelier to recommend pairings, but a curator, a storyteller, someone who understands that a wine list is not a collection of expensive labels, but a library of narratives, someone with unimpeachable integrity. He let the words hang in the air, the implication clear. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "I've seen your resume on paper, Ms. Vance. It says Waitress," he continued. "But I saw your real resume last night. It is written in passion, resilience, and a profound, generational knowledge that cannot be taught in any certification program." He leaned back in his chair. "I am not offering you a job. A job is something you can be fired from. I am offering you a position. Head sommelier and wine director for the Sterling Grand. You will have a full budget, complete autonomy over the cellar, and a team to build. You will not just be serving the story in the bottle, you will be choosing which stories we tell." The sheer scale of the offer was dizzying. It was a dream she had never even dared to have. To go from disgraced waitress to the wine director of the most anticipated new hotel in the city was a leap of faith so vast it terrified her. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "I haven't curated a list in 5 years. The industry changes so quickly." "Nonsense," Sterling cut her off, not unkindly. "The fundamentals do not change. Passion does not go out of style. Integrity does not have a vintage. We will provide any resources you need to get back up to speed. All I need from you is the fire I saw last night." He raised an eyebrow. "The question is, do you still have it? Do you want this fight?" Did she want it? It was like asking a drowning person if they wanted to breathe. It was a chance not just to rebuild her own life, but to build something that would stand as a testament to her grandfather's legacy, a direct challenge to the very people who had destroyed him. Tears of shock, relief, and a fierce, burning sense of purpose welled in her eyes. She nodded, unable to form words. "Good," Sterling said, a rare, broad smile spreading across his face. "Then let's get to work. We have a cellar to build and an empire to challenge." The news of Ilara's appointment at the Sterling Grand was the third and final act of the public drama. It was no longer just a story about a waitress besting a bully. It was a story of redemption and righteous battle. The media narrative solidified. Ilara Vance, the keeper of an authentic family legacy, had joined forces with Arthur Sterling, the self-made titan, to take on the corrupt, inherited power of the Crofts. The GoFundMe, at Ilara's request, was closed, and the entire sum, now over $150,000, was donated in her grandfather's name to a charity that provided legal aid to small business owners. It was a final, elegant checkmate. The journey, however, was far from over. Ilara's new life was not a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of the hardest work she had ever known. The first few months were a blur of 16-hour days. She wasn't just tasting wine. She was negotiating with distributors, designing a state-of-the-art cellar, interviewing and hiring staff, and immersing herself in the minutiae of inventory and cost control. She faced skepticism from some of the old guard suppliers who saw her as a media phenomenon, a flash in the pan. She had to earn their respect not with her story, but with her knowledge and professionalism, one grueling meeting at a time. As the opening of the Sterling Grand approached, the Crofts, who had been publicly silent, began to move in the shadows. A series of anonymous, negative articles appeared in obscure online blogs, attempting to paint Ilara as an opportunist and a fraud. A crucial shipment of rare Italian wines she had sourced directly from a small family vineyard in Piedmont, her grandfather's home region, was mysteriously held up in customs for weeks due to a sudden, paperwork issue. Elara knew it was Julian Croft IV, pulling strings from his exile in London, trying to sabotage her opening night. Working with Sterling's logistics team, she spent frantic, sleepless nights on the phone with customs officials and shipping agents, refusing to be beaten. The wine was finally released just 2 days before the hotel's grand opening. The opening night of the Sterling Grand was the most talked-about event of the year. The city's elite, including many who had witnessed the fateful night at the Pinnacle, filled the cellar to capacity. Elara, dressed not in a waitress's uniform, but in an elegant, custom-tailored suit that Sterling had insisted upon, moved through the room with a quiet, commanding confidence. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was the heart of the room. Late in the evening, an uninvited guest arrived. Julian Croft IV, back from London against his father's orders, strode into the restaurant, his face a mask of cold fury. He cornered Elara near the wine station. "Enjoying your 15 minutes of fame?" he sneered, his voice low. "You think this is a victory? You're a novelty, a circus act. Once the story gets old, Sterling will toss you aside like all the rest." Elara finished pouring a glass of champagne for a guest before turning to face him. She was no longer the intimidated, exhausted waitress he had tried to break. She was the mistress of her own domain, surrounded by a cellar she had built and a team she had trained. She looked at him, not with anger or fear, but with a cool, professional pity. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice calm and even. "This was never about fame. It was about respect, something you can't buy, and you clearly will never understand." She gestured to the bustling, vibrant room. "This is my victory. It's building something real, something with soul." She picked up a bottle of wine from the counter, the very same Barolo from her grandfather's region that he had tried to block. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to. Real connoisseurs. Unlike yourself, they're more interested in what's in the bottle than what's on the label." It was a final, quiet dismissal, more devastating than any public humiliation. Defeated, stripped of his last attempt at intimidation, Julian turned and stalked out of the restaurant, a ghost at a celebration of his own demise. Months later, Elara stood in the cool, quiet sanctuary of her cellar before the start of service. The rows of bottles, each one chosen with care and purpose, represented a library of stories waiting to be told. Her new life was demanding, exhausting, and more fulfilling than she could ever have imagined. She had saved nearly every penny of her generous salary, and in her apartment, blueprints for a small, new and improved Vino e Vita were spread across her kitchen table. It was no longer a phantom limb. It was a future she was actively, tangibly building. The story was never about a single night or a $25,000 wager. It was about the enduring truth that true value isn't found in a bank account, but in the legacy you honor and the integrity you refuse to sell. Julian Croft IV, in his arrogance, had dared a waitress to perform a party trick. He had no way of knowing he was challenging the spirit of a generations-old love affair with the vine, and in doing so, he hadn't just lost a bet, he had uncorked a reckoning.